There are many events that were key in forging the history of the 20th century, ranging from the outbreak of the First World War right through to a man walking on the moon. Great scientific discoveries, including that of penicillin and the structure of DNA, were made. Incredible works of art by the likes of Picasso were painted, while composers and musicians as diverse as Edward Elgar and Elvis Presley created the soundtrack of the decades. Yet, for many of us, the events that took place on a clear, moonless night in April 1912 are even more memorable than the greatest achievements of the age. We are talking about the RMS Titanic, arguably one of the greatest man-made wonders of the 20th century. Brought to life by Belfast's finest shipbuilders in Harland and Wolff's majestic shipyard on the River Lagan, she was a miracle of modern engineering. Thousands of people flocked to wave Titanic farewell on her maiden voyage as she set sail for New York, with no idea that within a matter of days she would lie wrecked at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, claiming the lives of over 1,500 passengers and crew. The story of that fateful night truly is the stuff of legend, and more than a century later, the world never tires of hearing the tales of Titanic. The names of the major players in this incredible saga have been immortalised in a succession of documentaries and films, including the brilliant ship's architect Thomas Andrews, Captain Edward Smith, who went down with the ship, and even the much maligned Joseph Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, who escaped with his life, but sadly not his reputation. However, the hero of this Titanic story was not aboard when disaster struck, nor was he instrumental in building the pride of the White Star Line. In fact, in the early hours of April the 15th, 1912, he was more than 3,000 miles away in the sleepy village of Pont Llanfraith near Blackwood in South Wales. Artie Moore, better known as Artie, was born in Pont Llanfraith in 1887, the eldest son of the local miller. An early and very enthusiastic amateur wireless operator who had built his own equipment here at the family's Gelligroes mill. Artie picked up the most famous SOS message of all time as Titanic sank beneath the icy waves of the North Atlantic. This delightful gathering is a commemorative event hosted by Blackwood and District Amateur Radio Society to mark the centenary of the sinking of Titanic and celebrate the achievements of Artie Moore, who went on to play a significant role in the development of wireless telegraphy. The guest of honour is Margaret Hopkins, the niece of Artie Moore, who is unveiling a commemorative plaque in her uncle's honour. So who better to introduce us to the gifted young Welshman who heard the Titanic sinking live from Gelligroes mill.
Sadly, it wasn't believed that he'd heard it for 2 days, which is rather sad, because I feel perhaps they could have saved more had they recognised his genius at the time. He was a man who was shy. I think he would have appreciated the day, but I don't think he would have asked for it, certainly not. But it's good to see the people honouring him here today, and I'm delighted that I'm here to witness it. Well, the local people thought it was brilliant, but it was so new, the venture at the time, shortwave radio, that few people did the shortwave actually. So, and as a humble man, but not an academic or a scientist, that he should have done it, I think is quite remarkable.
That Artie Moore was something of a phenomenon is an understatement. especially as he suffered an accident in childhood that would have been an absolute disaster for many a young lad. Yet the consequences of this unfortunate incident would shape Artie's future and see him enter the pages of the history books in his own very unique way.
There's something about Artie Moore. He lived a mysterious life. There's some guardian angel that protect him. I mean, you think of him as a young man when he fell into the machinery of the mill. You know, he had his leg mangled up, and they had to, unfortunately, amputate it. And because he only had one leg, he couldn't, and a big chunk of wood, he couldn't play football with his mates, he couldn't run around with his mates, he couldn't do all the things he wanted to do, but it didn't interfere with his brain. He was sort of a clever guy. And with his interest, he read of a competition, and he built a steam engine which has survived. It was in that mill for 100 years, and nobody cared about it. It was not very loving, and it just sat there in the corner, slowly rotting away, a little brass steam engine, and nobody touched it. It just slowly rotted away. But then they recognized what it was, and it's now in a museum where it is due to be kept. When Artie made that little steam engine, he put it in a contest, and he won first prize. And his first prize was a book. And he got this book, and the book was on electronics and radio, and it told you about Heinrich Hertz and Bard and Maxwell, and all the interesting people, the scientists and theorists that are doing, and Marconi that are doing stuff with radio. So Artie Moore decides to go down the route of radio.
In the 1900s, a family that lived here were called the Moore family, and one of their children, Artie, had a terrible accident in the mill, losing his leg in the mill machinery, and that was when he was in his early teens. And while he was convalescing, he built this little steam engine, and he spent 2 years building this steam engine, and he sent it off to a competition at Model Engineers, and he won the prize. And the prize was a book on how to build a radio called Modern Views on Electricity and Magnetism, written by Oliver Lodge and Heinrich Hertz. Anyway, that book went all over the world, and people were experimenting making radios. Now, up to this point, as I say, I thought that Marconi had invented radio, but he didn't at all. He just perfected it and realised the commercial value of it all. Anyway, completely independent of Marconi, Artie Moore and his friend Richard Jenkins sent radio messages to one another up the mountain, and they regularly used the radio.
The early years of the 20th century proved to be a time of great engineering development. And for Artie Moore, experimenting with wireless, the world was quite literally his oyster. By 1910, Artie and his friend Richard Jenkins had developed a homemade wireless that allowed them to communicate. And when a message was received by Artie asking for grain to be delivered to Tŷ Llwyd, the farm owned by Richard's father, it was the first use of wireless for business purposes in Welsh history.
He used to send messages to his mate, Richard Jenkins, just across the valley, and they didn't have telephones, and they used to talk to each other every day, every night, doing Morse code. They have a really good chinwag keying up messages to each other. Nowadays, the youngsters send texts to each other, and they all shorten it up, but they don't realise 100 years ago we sent text by Morse code. See you soon. The letter C, the letter U, the letter S, the letter N. 4 letters that reads see you soon. And GN, good night. GB, goodbye. And the number 7, the number 3, 73, which means good luck and good health. Artie Moore was texting our CW 100 years ago. See, when you think about radio, Wales, Artie Moore, a Welshman living here in South Wales at this mill, and the house behind me he heard Titanic signal.
When it comes to the history of wireless, Wales does indeed have a very fine pedigree, because the world's first wireless communication across water was made in 1897, not far from Gelligroes Mill. The man responsible for this remarkable event was Guglielmo Marconi, the Italian-born great-grandson of John Jameson, founder of the Irish whiskey distillers Jameson and Sons.
Guglielmo Marconi, a young man, 21 years of age, came across from Italy to Wales, and he met Sir William Preece, who was head of Queen Victoria's Post Office and Communication, and they came to Lavenot Point, which is not, 20 miles from here, down on the south coast, just up from Barry, at about 10 miles west of Cardiff. He came to Lavenot Point in May 1897, and he sent a radio signal from Flatholm Island to Lavenot Point. And on the 11th of May 1897, he proved that an electromagnetic wave could cross water. The Marconi Company grew, and there was a Marconi transmitter on board the Titanic, and it was a Marconi wireless operator that sent the distress signal.
Just 5 years later, the first radio message across the Atlantic would be sent from a Marconi radio station in Canada. And when it came to inspiration, Artie Moore could ask for no greater hero in whose footsteps to follow than Guglielmo Marconi. Operating the same type of spark gap transmitter and Morse code as used by the Marconi Company, Artie would hardly have dared to dream that one day he might meet Marconi, let alone be invited to work for him. But fate and Titanic would draw the two men together in the most extraordinary way. While Artie was busy building his transmitter in South Wales, across the water in Belfast, work was already underway at the Harland and Wolff shipyard to construct the world's largest and most luxurious ocean-going liner, the Titanic.
Well, Titanic at the time was the largest ship in the world. When Olympic was launched, she was the biggest ship. But they had to do some modifications on the Titanic, extra bedrooms, a closed-in promenade deck, and by the time they were finished, Titanic was now weighing over 46,000 tonnes, which was now 1,000 tonnes heavier than her identical sister ship Olympic, which made her the largest man-made floating object in the world at the time when she left here. She was 882.5 feet long. This is the biggest ship in the world. She was 92.5 feet wide. She was 175 feet from the keel to the top of the smokestacks. She could do over 23 knots. She was a very impressive ship indeed. She was the most luxurious ship in the world, and she's one of the first ships in the world that would have a swimming pool, a gymnasium, and Turkish baths, all on this beautiful, beautiful vessel. So some very interesting facts and figures. One interesting statistic is that Titanic had 3 engines, but had 4 funnels. And the last funnel on the Titanic was actually not real. It was only there for ventilation for the engine room and to look more aesthetically pleasing to the ship. A very interesting fact, you'll never probably ever notice any smoke coming out of the last funnel because it wasn't real.
To understand the enormity of the task the White Star Company had set for themselves with the building of Titanic, a visit to Belfast and the breathtaking Titanic experience is an absolute must. Here you can walk where the engineering pioneers who transformed the White Star Line's vision into a reality once passed by. From the drawing board of Thomas Andrew came the blueprints for a ship destined to make front page news and provide Artie Moore with the means to meet Marconi face to face.
It's a real economic driver for our city. This building, both the conference and banqueting and the visitor attraction, now gives Belfast standout. It gives our city something completely unique that no one else has, whether it's for an international medical conference, whether it's for a group of Japanese visitors on a coach, whether it's for a German cruise ship, whether it's for a local family on a day out. Everyone has got a reason to come to Titanic Belfast, whether for business, for leisure, for education. The story of Titanic continues here at Titanic Belfast.
1911 was a year of huge progress in the construction of the Titanic, and Artie Moore's skills as a wireless operator were progressing at an equally significant rate. One of the greatest joys for radio enthusiasts to this day is the excitement of never knowing whose transmission they might pick up from anywhere in the world. And for Artie, listening at his workshop in 1911, it must have been incredible to pick up a message announcing that Italy had declared war on Libya, resulting in Artie's first taste of making headline news.
Artie Moore and his friend Richard Jenkins sent radio messages to one another up the mountain. One night in 1911, they're listening to their anything they could receive on the airwaves, and they picked up a message that Italy had declared war in Tripoli, and that news got them on the front page of the Daily Sketch. And a photographer came down here and took pictures of the village and the radio boys' workshops.
Artie Moore's notoriety making the front pages was short-lived on this occasion, but interest in Titanic was constantly growing. The sheer luxury of the fit-out aroused the curiosity of the waiting world, and rumours of millionaire suites, gourmet restaurants and even a swimming pool attracted the attention of the richest transatlantic travellers. Ensuring the comfort of the White Star Company's most prestigious passengers was paramount, and it was for this reason, more so than safety, which saw Marconi called upon to install a state-of-the-art wireless room aboard Titanic.
So the radio room in Titanic was relatively new technology, of course developed by the Marconi Wireless Company. Interesting thing about Marconi was that nobody else could operate these radios except for Marconi's own wireless operators. So he had the license to use these on each passenger liner, which of course made Marconi a very wealthy man. The radio operators were very well paid as well. I believe around about £12 to £14 a week, which was very good. And of course, the radio was there would be very handy if the ship was in distress and it had a range of 400 or 500 miles or more to contact our ships. But the main use of it was to make money, and to make money, the radio room would be used to send private messages. To loved ones on the shore, maybe the destination they're heading for. So wealthy passengers could say, we're arriving in New York on such and such a night, have my private car ready, or whatever it may be, or the hotel could be booked for me. And this is quite a novelty for passengers. And so they were charged a fee to send these messages, which made good money for the Marconi wireless operators. Of course, on the night of the disaster, you had Bride and Phillips were the two radio operators. One of those gentlemen sadly lost his life in the disaster. The radio room was essential on the night of the disaster, but of course it contacted the other ships in the area. The closest one, around about 58 miles away, was the Carpathia. So if it wasn't for the radio room, and of course being in use at the time, who knows what could have happened. Everybody could have lost their lives on Titanic. So because of the radio operations, Carpathia could make it there to save the remaining passengers in the lifeboats.
Ironically, despite the lavish surroundings, the equipment used for the Marconi room was a spark gap transmitter, just like the one used in Getley Groy's mill by Artie Moore.
The equipment aboard the Titanic would have used what's known as a spark gap transmitter. At the time that the Titanic sank, there were no valves or transistors available. The equipment would have been something similar to what I have in front of me. So in the centre of this equipment is an iron core, and wrapped around the core is many thousands of wire turns. An electrical supply would be connected to the coil, and using an interrupter device at the end here, the device would generate high voltages and a spark across these two brass spheres on top of the equipment. Attached to these, Artie would have used, or the radio operator aboard the Titanic would have used lengths of wire from which radio waves would have been sent out to receiving equipment on other ships and land-based stations.
The radio equipment Artie had or constructed was a rather crude receiver. It was a coherent-based receiver, which he constructed himself. So it was pretty crude, but it was capable of receiving these signals, of course. He also built his own spark transmitter, based loosely on the one on the Titanic, but obviously much cruder. So he was a very early experimenter in that regard.
When work on Titanic was completed, she set sail for Southampton on the 2nd of April 1912. After a week in port taking on supplies and many crew members to join those from Belfast, at 1:30 in the afternoon, Titanic's maiden voyage to New York began. Stopping at Cherbourg in France and Queenstown in County Cork, Southern Ireland, Captain Edward Smith took command in style. And if Artie Moore was aware of Titanic making waves, he was completely unaware of the impact this sailing was about to have on his life. Life aboard Titanic was the epitome of stylish elegance, and the voyage proved to be a true adventure as she cut her sway through the North Atlantic, hoping to reach New York in a faster time than her sister ship Olympic had done on her maiden voyage. Passengers' only concerns were how to spend their leisurely days and what culinary delights there would be on offer at dinner. Safety was simply not an issue. It was genuinely accepted that Titanic was unsinkable. With the ship's architect Thomas Andrews aboard with his guarantee group to iron out any teething problems, passengers would frequently hear him explain how the watertight compartment of Titanic's design assured a safe passage.
Well, this is quite standard, of course. All new ships, the delivery of a new ship to the White Star Line will always have teething problems. Every ship would have one, and of course the people who built it, which is Harland and Wolff, had to ensure that, especially for the maiden voyage there and back again, that the ship was running effectively. And Thomas Andrews took with him 8 other men who were skilled obviously in all aspects of shipbuilding, and their job was like basically troubleshooting to make sure the ship operated correctly, everything right from her engines, her boilers, her generators, right down to changing light bulbs and making sure that there's a potato peeler maybe in the kitchens, or enough potato peelers, right down from the very smallest thing to a stop clock right up to the functioning of the ship itself.
As a consequence, the notion that providing sufficient lifeboats for all passengers was dismissed as unnecessary. In fact, the White Star Line's decision to oppose adding more lifeboats to give passengers more room on the promenade decks was nothing out of the ordinary at the time. Before Titanic sank, there were no regulations to demand lifeboats were carried for all passengers. And unlike many suggested in the aftermath, it was definitely not a cost-cutting exercise. White Star Olympic class liners were the last word in luxury, and safety precautions were in keeping with what was expected in this golden age of transatlantic crossings. And the same principles applied to radio communications. The vital role this could play in keeping passengers and crew safe was yet to be realised. Just because Titanic had a state-of-the-art wireless room didn't mean it had been added primarily as a safety feature.
In 1912, radio equipment was very primitive. The type of radio equipment in use aboard Titanic could not send voice signals. It was only able to send Morse code signals. When the Titanic distress signal was sent, it was sent as a Morse signal for other ships and land-based stations to receive. The operator aboard the Titanic would have received messages to send, would have then encoded them into Morse code and tapped them out on a Morse key, which would be connected to equipment similar to what I have in front of me. Antennas aboard the Titanic would transmit that signal many hundreds of miles to other ships and stations to receive the signal.
As the name suggests, the Marconi Room's equipment did not belong to the White Star Line. and it was operated by the Marconi Company's staff as a money-making enterprise, sending messages for wealthy travellers from ship to shore. It was certainly a lucrative business, and at this very early stage in development, it was young men who were radio enthusiasts, just like Artie Moore, who became Marconi operators. With the technology so new, when things went wrong, which they often did, the backlog of messages left them working around the clock. The day before Titanic hit the iceberg, her two Marconi operators, Harold Bride and Jack Phillips, had needed to repair a burnt-out transformer in the transmitter, and it had been a lengthy operation. The messages stacked up, and when communications were restored, the pressure was really on. Piecing together Titanic's wireless traffic from the night of the 14th of April into the early hours of the next day does help to build up a picture of what happened. And it soon becomes evident that there was a missed opportunity for many more lives to have been saved. The ship that was destined to be the closest to Titanic when she ran into difficulties was the Leyland Lime steamer, the SS Californian. There was just one wireless operator aboard, Cyril Evans, and when icebergs were spotted on Titanic's course, he sent a warning message, which was picked up and delivered to Titanic's bridge. No action was taken. The next exchange of messages between the Californian and Titanic had been key to the many investigations of what happened that night to have taken place since. As the evening of April the 14th wore on, bright and clear, but with no moon, the Californian encountered a large ice field off the Great Banks of Newfoundland, and taking the decision that it was too dangerous to proceed, the captain, Stanley Lord, gave the order to stop till morning. After consulting Cyril Evans to ascertain if there were other ships in the vicinity, he instructed Evans to send a warning message to Titanic, which he duly did. Due to the close proximity of the two ships and the primitive spark gap transmitters, Evans' message was piercingly loud, obliterating Phillips' exchange with Cape Race. Without taking heed of the message, Phillips radioed back and told Evans to clear the frequency as he was busy. At 11:30 p.m, Evans turned off his equipment and went to bed. It was only 10 minutes after the Californian's wireless operator had shut down his station and gone to bed that Frederick Fleet, on watch in Titanic's crow's nest, spotted the menacing outline of an iceberg. He raised the alarm, and First Officer Murdoch gave the order to turn the ship, but it was to no avail. Just 37 seconds after the iceberg had come into view, it ripped a gash along Titanic's side as the two entities collided. The speed of events and the realization for Captain Smith that the wound to his ship was fatal set a sequence of events in motion. At 5 minutes past midnight, he ordered the lifeboats uncovered before making his way to the wireless room where Bride and Phillips were discussing the recent unexplained jolt they had just experienced. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in South Wales, Artie Moore was, as was so often the way, listening in at his wireless, practicing his now well-tuned receiving skills.
Well, after the ship had hit the iceberg, there was obviously quite a bit of panic amongst the people who were in the know. And eventually the CQD SOS was sent out by the Chief Radio Officer, Jack Phillips, and he would have transmitted out CQD, MGY and the position of the ship. In the final stages of that, the new signal, SOS, was finally used. This was transmitted out to all ships in the vicinity. I think the Carpathia was in the near vicinity. Californian was in the vicinity. In fact, the Californian, I think, was the closest ship to the Titanic. But unfortunately, they'd shut off their radio equipment for the night, so they weren't aware of what was actually happening at the Titanic. The two radio operators were sending out the signal frantically, the CQD and the SOS, were sending out to all ships, and the Californian would have received it, probably. Had they had their wireless transmitter on, it was actually switched off, because in those days, after 12 midnight, there was no legal requirement to keep your radio on for watch. So it would have been the Carpathia. I think the Olympic received it from some distance from the Titanic. Also, there was a ship called the Baltic. They would have received it. And the land-based station at Cape Race would probably have received it as well.
The first of Titanic's distress calls that went out was picked up by a number of ships, and also the Cape Race shore station. With the Californian's wireless room shut down for the night, the ship that heard Titanic's cry for help and was able to reach her first was the RMS Carpathia, and it was quite by chance that she did. Again, the ship had only one radio operator, Harold Cottam, and he missed the live transmission as he was reporting the events of the day to the bridge. When he returned to his wireless room, as he too prepared to shut down for the night, he noticed there was a batch of messages from Cape Cod coming through for Titanic, so he called up Phillips and Bride to let them know. The chilling reply came back: "Struck a berg, come at once," which was followed by CQD, the standard Marconi distress signal, and Titanic's position.
When the Titanic hit the berg and was on the verge of sinking, she sent out a distress signal, and the ship previously had sent warnings to the Titanic, was the California, and that poor ship really got castigated. Now what happened, the California sent a warning to the Titanic that there was large icebergs, and the California was had stopped, finished with engines, had stopped in an ice flow because it's too dangerous. And the ship's radio operators on the Titanic told the California radio man to go away, QSY in radio jargon, to be polite, because these radio people were sending messages and receiving messages for the passengers and earning money for the Marconi company, stocks and shares and what the market's like and stuff like that. To hear weather forecasts, they weren't interested in weather forecasts. There was no money in weather forecasts, so they told the California man to go away. So the single wireless operator on board the California said, okay, and with a bee in his ear, he switched off his radio and went to bed. There was a fireman that came out of the engine room and wanted to smoke, so he just to cool down because he'd been in the engine room, and he just leaning over the rail, and he saw these white lights going up in the air, and he thought, oh, some ship's celebrating, because in them days there was no international colour. So the Titanic unfortunately had white flares, so she sent them up, and the California man thought, oh, just flares, somebody's having a party, and he went to bed, and that was the end of it. And then he didn't see it anymore because the ship had sunk before his eyes, and that was the end of the Titanic.
Carpathia was at least 3 hours sailing time away, and when Cottam reported to his captain, Arthur Rostron, the order was given to race to Titanic's aid, and for Cottam to send a message saying they were coming as fast as they could. Titanic was sinking fast, and it wasn't long before Captain Smith realised that the ship would be lost beneath the waves long before anyone could reach them. Further distress signals were sent, and the new SOS signal was used as the wireless operators joked with their captain, saying, "Send SOS, it's the new call. It may be your last chance to send it."
During the sinking, she sent out a distress signal, and she sent out da-di-da-di, da-da-di-da, da-di-dit. CQD, come quickly, disaster. Come quickly, danger. Come quickly, disaster. And but ships were kind of responding, but she wasn't sure. So Captain Smith told the radio operators to use the new international signal, which is did-it-it, da-da-da, did-it-it, the famous SOS. And that making the Titanic the very first ship to send an international marine distress signal. Now, look where we are. We're in a mill, in a valley in South Wales. Now, note what I said. We are in a valley. Everywhere you look, you see a hill or a mountain. We're totally blocked off by radio signals. So it's quite difficult for a radio signal to get into this valley.
So while all this was going on, Artie Moore was sat at his wireless, listening with disbelief to the transmissions that were starting to come through from the world-famous Titanic. A faint Morse signal asked for immediate assistance, and gradually the messages became even more desperate until all went silent. Harold Bride and Jack Phillips did all that they could, and undoubtedly had it not been for their messages, many more passengers and crew would have lost their lives. When all hope was lost, Captain Smith went back to their wireless room and told them that it was every man for himself. Harold Bride survived, but Jack Phillips did not.
Right to the very last, the radio operators, give it right down to the very last ounces of electricity and power to the ship. The radio operators were desperately trying to contact a closer ship to them. One of those ships was the Californian, that was around about 10 to 15 miles away, or even less, that they had tried desperately to call and contact, but unfortunately they did nothing, and Titanic sank literally right in front of them. So nearly till the water was lapping around their feet, the radio operators stayed at their post to the last. Very interesting that the range of these radios was just a few hundred miles. And there's a story in Wales that a gentleman picked up Titanic's distress calls on the 15th of April, some 3,000 miles away in Wales. It's incredible.
The signals become more intense, more closer together. Please help, we are sinking. Ship could go down at any minute. On board, while the crew were helping passengers to the lifeboats, the wireless operators stayed at their posts and tried to get anybody who could help in the vicinity. But there was a time when very close to the end, the wireless operators were told by the captain, save yourself, but they stayed at their post. The chief wireless operator, Jack Phillips, he stayed at his post and he went down with the ship. But Harold Bride, the second operator, he actually survived. He got in a lifeboat and survived.
Carpathia picked up the signal and steamed. She was about 50 odd miles away, and she said, "I'll be there in about 3 hours," and she steamed flat out through pack ice and incredibly dangerous, but to try and save lives. And she got there, and you've got to imagine when she arrived on the scene, total desolation, but eerily quiet. The sea was unusually calm. There was dead bodies floating in life jackets, freezing cold because there's icebergs and sheet ice floating around everywhere, fragments of ice, so the water is below freezing. People were dead in their life jackets. They were dying on rafts, dying in the boats of hypothermia, and she got there and she rescued the people. She rescued 704 souls from that disaster.
Interestingly, Had it not been for the Marconi wireless room, Titanic would have been reliant solely on distress flares. And there is an added irony here, as it would have again been the SS Californian in range to spot the flares, which they did indeed see, but failed to act upon. There were more than 1,500 souls lost when Titanic sank to the ocean floor at 2:20 a.m. on the 15th of April 1912. There was a lifeboat capacity to rescue some 1,100, but just over 700 were picked up by the Carpathia and taken to New York. In the aftermath of the disaster, 29 nations ratified the Radio Act of 1912, which required 24-hour radio watch on board all ships in case of emergency. Artie Moore was astounded by what he had heard, and like every good radio operator to this very day, carefully recorded the messages. Quickly rushing to tell the police, who didn't believe a word of what he was saying, the locals soon heard his incredible news. How could the Titanic possibly have been lost at sea? She was, as everyone knew, unsinkable.
The Titanic's radio signal left the aerial. It went the full length of the ship. It left the aerial, and the radiation, electromagnetic wave, went up to the ionosphere and came down again, hit the ocean, it landed on the Atlantic Ocean and bounced straight back up again, just like bouncing a pebble across the pond, and then came down in this little valley. And just by sheer fluke, Artie Moore was tuning this coil, which is literally a coil of wire with a couple of takeoff points, and he heard did-it-it, da-da-da, did-it-it, SOS, Titanic, come at once, struck iceberg, sinking, CQD, SOS, sheer panic. Now Artie couldn't believe his ears. He's actually hearing the biggest ship in the world. It's not a spoof, because nobody mucks around sending SOSs on radio. And this man, he can notice from the speed of the Morse, the urgency in the key, and he can hear the sound. So he scribbles it all down on his message pad. He runs out of the mill and then contacts the local policeman, who said, "Artie, you're tup. You're stupid. The Titanic is unsinkable. Go back to your electric toys. The Titanic. What's up with you, man?" And the rest is history. He was the first man in the United Kingdom, or in Europe, because they heard the signal in America, but nobody heard it in Europe, or if they did, they never reported it. And Artie, this miller in South Wales, heard that first signal. It's just astounding. He happened to be at the right place at the right time, and he did something about it. That's the important thing. He faced ridicule, but he knew what he heard. He knew. He copied the Morse correctly. He was an intelligent man. He knew what he heard. He heard CQD, SOS. He heard that code, and it's unmistakable. It was unique. And then a couple of days later, the world knew.
The following morning, he went to the local police station, which is just down the road in Annecy, and he reported the signals that he'd heard from the Titanic. But whether it was logged, or they just thought he was silly, you know. He just thought he was just making things up. And then eventually, a few days later, it was front page on the national tabloid, you know, national press. So it was true. It's just nobody believed him. It was just so far-fetched that nobody would say, "No, you didn't hear that." You're talking about 3,000 miles distance between ship and Getty Groyce.
Within days, though, it was a different story. The headlines completely vindicated Artie, and the detail of his report, including the use of the new SOS distress call, transformed him from being a village idiot to a local celebrity.
The equipment that the radio operators were using was a spark gap transmitter, which gave a rasping sound, unlike the Morse we hear today. This was thought to have travelled some 500 miles, I think, in daylight hours, but in night hours is some 2,000 miles. But incredibly, this signal had bounced 3,000 miles down into the Guthrie Royce, to the Guthrie Royce mill in a point of faith, and this was probably due to exceptional propagation conditions.
Yet again, Artie Moore and his homemade wireless hit the front pages of the national newspapers. Only this time, unlike when he had heard that Italy had declared war on Libya back in 1911, picking up Titanic's final transmissions would change his life.
Now, 6 months later, Artie was in the mill and he heard this message that the Titanic had sunk, and he just could not believe his ears, went rushing down to the village to tell the policeman, who he thought was the best person to tell, and they wouldn't believe him. They thought, it's unsinkable, you're mad. And it was 3 days it took for the news to come through, the enormity of the disaster. And the next day in the Times, they said Titanic struck iceberg, all passengers safe. So I mean, news really travelled very slowly in those days.
Before 1912 was over, he was offered a place at the British School of Telegraphy, where he studied for 3 months to pass the government exams for wireless telegraphy and Morse code. Also, a local resident had written to the great Marconi, no less, telling him of Artie's skills and the transmissions he had picked up at Guthrie Royce mill.
Of course, after these events, Artie's life changed dramatically. He was invited by Marconi to join the Marconi company as a radio draftsman. And of course, he went on then to invent a thing called the echometer, which is a very early form of sonar. And he also was involved, I believe, in the development of the thermionic valve, of which, if that hadn't been developed, of course, there would be no radio as you know it today, in the modern sense.
Marconi then came down here to visit Artie, just to see what his equipment was like, because he couldn't believe he'd got this message. He thought radio waves went for something like 500 miles, and they went 2,000 to here. And anyway, he came down, looked at Artie's equipment, was most impressed, and then Artie worked for him for the rest of his life, going on to invent a thermionic valve.
And so it transpired that Guillermo Marconi came to visit Artie Moore at his mill in South Wales to see the spark gap transmitter that had picked up Titanic's SOS. Fate had brought Marconi and Artie together, and ironically, had Marconi taken the free passage he was offered on Titanic to New York, instead of travelling 3 days earlier on the Lusitania, it might never have happened. Marconi would no doubt have been surprised at the range of the wireless transmission from Titanic all the way to South Wales, as it was much further than even he could have anticipated.
It's not unusual for radios, waves, especially Morse code, to be heard much further distances than they normally are. It's called harmonics in the atmosphere. They can transmit it a lot further away. When Amelia Earhart disappeared in 1937, a woman called Betty over in California picked up apparently her radio distress signals thousands of miles away, way beyond the range of conventional radio. So there is cases where radio waves can be picked up at much greater distances, and it's all to do with the harmonics in the atmosphere, and it can happen, and nobody can really discount it.
Artie Moore was invited to join the world-famous Marconi company, where he went on to play a significant role supervising wireless installations for the Admiralty after the outbreak of the First World War. It had been quite a decade for Artie, and after the armistice was signed in 1918, during peacetime, he worked for Marconi in Liverpool, fitting the most up-to-date transmitters to ships. The First World War was declared to have been the war to end all wars, but as history attests, it did not. By the time the world went to war again in 1939, Artie Moore had patented an early form of sonar, the acronym for Sound, Navigation and Ranging. The science behind this was developed to counter the threat of the German U-boats to the Allied forces, and yet again, Artie had been way ahead of his time.
In 1932, he patented a device called the echometer, which was sending sound waves from the surface of the sea down to the ocean floor, and then the echo would bounce back, and you could calculate how long it took to come back, how deep the sea was. And that went on to become sonar, and it was sonar that they used to track down the wreck of the Titanic.
Artie continued to work for the Marconi Company until he retired in 1947, and with his health failing, a year later he travelled to Jamaica in the hope that the climate would improve things. Sadly, he would never see Wales and Gelligroes Mill again, because he returned to Bristol to convalesce, where he died on Thursday the 20th of January 1949. When Guillermo Marconi died in 1937, to mark with respect his passing, there was 2 minutes radio silence worldwide. His achievements were recognised on a global scale. In contrast, when Artie died, there were few, other than friends and family, who knew anything about the modest Welshman who had a remarkable capacity for science and technology. So it is only right and proper that the enthusiasts of Blackwood and District Amateur Radio Society have commemorated their most extraordinary predecessor by transmitting from Gelligroes Mill. For visitors today who hear Artie Moore's story, this is a wonderful snapshot of history that is as unspoilt and evocative as it was when Titanic's dying moments were heard here over a century ago.
The Blackwood and District Radio Society was formed after the initial society, which is the Blackwood Transmitters Club, which was formed in 1927. Of course, this would have been spurred on by what Artie had done in previous years. The society today is putting on a station here at Gelligroes Mill to commemorate the fact that Artie has received this signal from the Titanic. So we here commemorating the 100 years of Artie Moore receiving the Titanic signal over the 14th and 15th of April. We put on 2 stations here at the mill. The SSB, or voice station then, if you like, is on the lower floor. And the all-important one, of course, is the CW, as we call it, or Morse code, as most people know it as, which is on the upper floor of the mill. And of course, Artie would have used Morse code because that was the earliest form of radio communication in his day.
And of course, we are in very good company today, with Artie's niece, Margaret, immortalising her uncle's part in the story of Titanic. And each new generation will be able to come and see where the true master of innovation diligently and modestly made history.
He was a shy man. He never sought to be honoured in any way whatsoever. But Marconi, when he heard of it, he came here to see him and was absolutely flabbergasted at the man's genius. From there on, its history, how he worked with Marconi in London and achieved a great deal. Not only was it the Titanic, but the Second World War, he did a lot with sonar and travelled the world with sonar on the ships and on submarines. So he really was a man who had achieved a great deal in his time. He loved children, he loved cars, 2 lovely Alvis cars, one a sports car, the other a saloon, of which I had great pleasure in driving, thinking at the time I was someone special in the village. Well, I think he would have been quite shocked, but obviously delighted. of all this happening, because this was the last thing he thought was for people to make a fuss about it. He would be more keen that young people were here today to know that they too could play their part in the world if they were determined to succeed in science. Well, I remember Morse's generosity. Obviously, he wasn't a poor man in the end, so as his niece, and he without any children but loved children, I was extremely fortunate to have such an uncle. It's something I'm learning all the time, because I heard very little about it at the time, because I wasn't here. It was 13 years before I was born and it happened. But I've been hearing things today and seeing how men has honoured him 100 years after it happened, which rather thrills me to see this happening here today. And as I say, it's a great pleasure that I'm here. I'm delighted.
When the last living survivor of Titanic, Milvina Dean, came to South Wales to visit Artie's wireless room in 2002 and saw this actual equipment that had picked up Titanic's SOS message, she was amazed and remarked, "This will be a part of history." Milvina was just 9 weeks old when she was lowered into lifeboat 13.
If you're on a little lifeboat and then there's a big ship above you trying to get you on board, how are they going to get you on board? They drop scramble nets over the side and you try and climb up these nets best you can, but bearing in mind you've been in the ocean for 4 or 5 hours, really cold, your hands hurt, and the thing is something you to think about. How are you going to bring up little babies? Because it was women and children first. So how are you going to bring babies up onto that ship? So what this Carpathia seaman came up with a brilliant idea. He got an empty potato sack, an empty potato sack, tied a rope around the sack and lowered the sack down into the boat. They put the little children into a sack. The child could breathe. It was dark, it calmed them down, and you very quickly pulled up the rope and you got the child on board the ship.
Her father sadly drowned that night, but her mother and brother were saved, thanks in no small part to the radio transmissions that Artie picked up. Many were rescued that night. Many more could have been. And the precedent set in the wake of Titanic, using the airwaves to save lives, continues to do just that. The technology may have changed, but the principles remain the same, and there is no finer tribute that Artie Moore and his fellow wireless telegraphy pioneers could ask for.